Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Shape the System. We're talking about food today, food waste maybe. Saadi, who's joined us from Subpod, as I was saying to him just before we jumped on, I've been a long-time observer and fan and supporter of what you're doing, and I want to talk about the product and just Subpod generally a bit later on, obviously. But what I first do, as we always do, is dive into the problem space, the place where you find yourselves. So, Saadi, if you don't mind, maybe just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about where you guys play, and we'll dive deeper into that to get started.
Thanks, Vincent. Look, I'm really happy to be here, and having listened to a number of your podcasts before, I really enjoy the way that you think and the questions that you ask. So excited for this talk. Yeah, the problem space really where Subpod is playing in is around waste, and food waste specifically, and thinking about how in our everyday life people can engage and connect with the natural systems that turn waste into a resource. Mm-hmm. And the Subpod is essentially a composting product that we've developed to help people to compost at home without smells and mess and hassle, right. Make it very easy to do that in a home environment. And also we have our systems that scale up to commercial level composting, but you're essentially composting in a garden bed in a system that's insulated by the soil and creates an environment that is really working with nature. And biomimicry is one of those areas that I'm particularly interested in. So my approach is nature's done 3.5 billion years worth of R&D on turning waste into a resource. And if we can work with that system rather than trying to develop other ways to do it, then we're probably ahead. Right. And really the work that we do has come out of, there's a lot of talk about recycling. There's a lot of talk about the circular economy. Mm-hmm. And it's quite a compelling concept for people who dig into it, but it can be quite hard for people to understand really what a closed loop system is, or what the circular economy is, where you're not trying to just use something and then dispose of it and it ends up in landfill. You're trying to turn waste into a resource. And Subpod is really a simplified home version of that, where you've got your garden bed that's fed by the waste you're putting into your system. Mm-hmm. The plant roots feed on the nutrients that are created in there, and you're able to turn your food waste into a resource at home, and your benefit is growing healthy plants, and quite often for most of the people it's growing healthy food, right. Which is an important thing, I think, in the world to, even if you're doing it just on a small level at home, it gets you thinking about things like supply chains and about where your food comes from and why it's important. So that's really the context that we're working in.
Okay. I want to come back a step to, I'm always keen to quantify the scope and the scale of this. I mean, the numbers may be specific just to Australia, but we can obviously take a 2% of our population and whatever that is, 50x it, and scale it up to global proportions. But when we think about a household, what is there, 11 million households in Australia, probably somewhere in that order of magnitude. Give me a sense of the amount of what I would call compostable output that's happening from each, output might be the wrong word, that's happening from each of these households. What's the scale of this problem? And then also what happens today to that waste, and why is that a problem?
Sure. So in terms of household food waste, it is quite a big problem in Australia. We have on average 300 kilos of food waste per person in a household in Australia.
Per year.
So it's costing Australian households up to $2,500 a year in wasted food. And what happens with that food, by and large, it ends up in landfill. And of course, there are council areas that have green waste collection and large-scale composting systems. However, when you start talking to waste specialists about the economics of trucking food waste around to move it from a household to these large facilities, it starts to look a bit scary from an economic standpoint. It doesn't work.
You're being diplomatic here.
Yeah. So you've got up to 80% of food waste is water by content.
Right.
So shipping water around really doesn't work. And there's impacts, of course, on the roads and infrastructure from truck movements. Sure. And so dealing with it on site is seen as the gold standard. And that's really what we're trying to get across with the work we do with Subpod is that, hey, this is a really big problem, but it's a problem that you can play a part in solving. And that's a message I think that's important for people to feel like they're part. It's not just them on their own. So that's why we talk a lot about community, and we have our composting community and we share stats about how much food waste we're offsetting as a community, because if you're doing it on your own, and sometimes it might feel insignificant, but once you realize, hey, there's 50 to 60,000 other people doing this with this system, and together we're offsetting thousands of tons of CO2 equivalents, it starts to feel like, hey, this is something that's meaningful.
I think I'm trying to remember one of the stats I read, but when you spoke about tons that your community, I'm going to use that word rather than customers, have actually collectively removed from landfill or essentially diverted away from, it's already in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tons, isn't it? Some ridiculous number already. Is that right?
Yeah, so CO2 equivalents per year in terms of emissions, it's over 14,000 tonnes a year that our community collectively, when we average out usage of systems, is offsetting or avoiding the emissions.
Yep.
And in terms of the actual food waste, I'm having a slightly blank moment in terms of the kilos, but I know it's over 3,000 garbage truck fulls, as the average garbage truck is 9 tonnes. So
excellent. I do want to talk more about community, because I think there's a thing here that we don't often connect with as either individuals but also as founders setting up things, especially for impact things, is the importance of feeling like you're part of some movement. But I think there's more to it than that. There's I think humans have always learnt in a social context, and so much of what we know how to do, we know through interactions with others or observing what's working for others. And the example I can think of at home, I'm in a cold environment in the Blue Mountains, renting and trying to work out what I could do to make my house warmer. I'm not in control of a lot of the things that would be the obvious levers, like solar and all these types of things. And so someone said, you should put seals on your doors. Like, it's about $4 to buy these things from Bunnings. You can do it yourself. Any renter can do it. They're not going to have a problem with doing it. And it probably made about a 20% difference, I reckon, to energy and usage. And it wasn't, but for lack of community, was hard to get that information. Do you find that that's a big part of how the community operates, is that they're not only here for the support and, being part of a larger movement, but actually helping people to understand practically how this stuff might work for them?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's a really important point for any type of behaviour change that you're trying to make happen in the world. We're social animals, and we learn through mimicry and we learn through pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. And so by making people think, hey, this is normal, look, other people are doing it, it breaks down a barrier. Yeah. And so we do that in our business from day one, before we even had the product out there, we started an online community.
Really?
That it's not on Facebook. We do have users who've set up Facebook groups, but we have our own platform called Grow Hub, which has over 20,000 users, and we have free courses and education, and there's a social element, so people can jump on there and ask questions or get advice from the community and from the team here as well. So we're really trying to make people feel like they're part of something and they're supported with the journey, and this is a normal thing to do.
Again, I hit you up the other day, I think on one of your LinkedIn posts, and I was like, I love the product, but I'm in a cold place and I rent. How am I going to make this work? And you're like, well, go here and here's all the things you can grow in cold places, and you can take this one with you so you can have it. And it wasn't that it stopped me from having excuses, but it kind of normalized that there's probably a solution for that. You just don't think that there is. And that was just a fascinating part of it. I want to come back to kind of the context as to why this is important now, just in the context of food waste as a system. But I am also interested in this idea that you kind of started with community. Did you start with community and say, we care about food waste, let's talk to people about growing their own food and having more connectivity to the food system generally, or supply chain of food, whatever the right term is? And then Subpod came along as a product. How did that arc of a story actually happen?
Look, we had the prototype. So I worked with a designer who came up with the original hand-built prototypes of Subpod, and that was clearly there as the product pathway.
Right.
But it was a highly ambitious, foolhardy venture in the beginning, and we needed people to get on board. So in the early days, Andrew Hayem de Vries, who was the original designer, would go and sit out the front of a local health food shop who had some garden beds and his prototypes, and run composting workshops for people before you could buy the product. And we just continued with that as we kind of moved on in the journey, and we had to create the story to actually fund the product. The original Subpod Classic that we have now, the larger version, that I had to kind of take that from this even bigger system that Andrew had into something we could manufacture. But even then, that was over $250,000 just for the mold itself.
Really? Wow.
Before we could start producing these. And so we used crowdfunding by and large to fund that. And so creating that community of people who wanted to get behind and support that was really key to being able to meet that ambitious goal of actually making Subpod a commercial product that you could go and buy.
Yeah.
And so that's why community's been important to us from day one.
Yeah, and I mean, my sense from talking to you prior to even jumping on is that you've kind of always been quite community-minded, or have grown up in a context where there was kind of a shared, kind of a collective view of the world. Is that, I might be, stretching a bit here, but am I reading that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I grew up in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, where I still live, which was kind of ground central for the alternative living and multiple occupancy movement, lifestyle movement back in the 70s and 80s.
And everything else.
Everything. So, yeah, when I was born, my folks were living on a intentional Buddhist community and lived on a couple of others. And so that was the context I grew up in, and all of these practices around sustainability. It was the beginning of the permaculture movement. Bodhi Farm, the community that we're living on when I was born, was home to some of the people who started the first solar power company in Australia, Rainbow Power. And so we had microgrids supplying power from a micro hydro system that they'd built on the creek, and people building methane digesting toilets and all kinds of things back in the,
So Subpod was back in the 80s. Inevitable. That's kind of where you're going with that.
Well, yeah. So I guess that's just been my context, and I've tried to do work around that. Yeah. Taking those kind of things I grew up with as normal out into the wider world and connecting people to nature.
Well, and that was kind of going to be my follow-up question to that, which was what you grew up with in the 80s. I think you were saying that was in the 80s and 90s, I guess, was not the norm. And, I would say to most people are not growing up necessarily in that kind of household environment. But the zeitgeist certainly has changed in the last 30 or 40 years, where we've had this, a large shift for people being, far more intentional in what they're doing, or more educated, or more conscious of making decisions that are aligned to their values. So I'm interested in those trends, but I'm also interested, as part of this as well, being that people, if you look at, say, China as a good, really kind of standout example, a massive shift from an agrarian society into the cities, and this has been happening globally for the last 50 years. Is part of this also the impetus for why food waste is becoming more and more of a problem? We're separated from where our food is grown and have no connectivity, and we're also in an environment where we kind of can't do anything with it because we're living in a high-rise apartment, so we kind of have to just turf it because we think that's our only option. Is that a little bit of what's at play here at a much larger macro level? Yeah, definitely. And it's beyond just the fact that, this is a problem. There's also, as you're starting to see more and more this idea of connecting with nature, and maybe a bit more of the romanticism about nature that was really part of the conservation movement starting back in the 1800s in America with the national parks movement. That's a key thing for a lot of people living in cities, is
how do we connect with nature? How do we have green spaces in our life? And that feeling of I might be missing out on something if I don't have some kind of literacy. So even people who don't have that for themselves are really wanting it for their children and wanting to find ways to have that in their lives. And part of my hypothesis, which led to Subpod being what it is today, was that we saw this boom in nature-based lifestyle brands kind of starting in the 70s and 80s with the likes of Patagonia, North Face, the Australian surf brands like Quicksilver, Billabong coming in and saying, hey, go and connect with nature. It's great. Go and climb a rock, walk a trail, jump on a wave.
Whatever it is.
All of those things that have created these massive movements and really cultures. And my thinking has been, and I'm hoping we've got the timing somewhat right, is that it's time for movements that still have that connection to nature, but instead of consumption of nature, it's recognizing we're part of the ecosystem, and that by doing things like gardening and composting and having a bit of eco-literacy, we can have a much more nuanced relationship with nature, which can be really deeply rewarding in many ways. Like there's many studies out there around forest bathing and those types of things for mental health. And then there's also work done around soil microbes and how they can affect your mental health in positive ways and things as well. So that's really the idea, is make things like composting and gardening as cool as wanting to go for a surf.
Yeah, or a complement to going for a surf, perhaps. I think you raise a really interesting point, because I think so much of how, like when I grew up, you would go out and go surfing or, bodyboarding in my case, but it was never a thought of, hey, isn't it great to be out in nature? It was this amazing experience out here, and it happens to be in nature, but those was almost fortuitous that those things were happening. I had a lettuce, I think a romaine lettuce that was in the fridge the other day, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to see if I can stick this on the windowsill. It's not -2 degrees today. And it started growing, and the amount of happiness and joy that came from observing this lettuce come back to life on my windowsill, I was like, I've got to be doing more of this. I'm curious, like taking the last 40 years, obviously as kind of a general trend, and you said an awakening in being not just out in nature, but actually starting to interact with nature in maybe more of a symbiotic way. Has some of that accelerated in the last 2 years? You just spoke about the timing right now. Is that relating to what's happened in the last 2 years, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it has definitely accelerated last couple of years, maybe a bit longer than 2 years. I mean, the previous business I was involved in had a similar ethos, and it seemed quite on the edge back in 2015 when we launched that one, and getting to kind of 2018, 19 started to feel like, okay, there's a much more critical mass here of people who are thinking about preserving biodiversity, who are concerned about natural ecosystems, species loss, all of these things. So they're looking for something tangible that they can do in their own life beyond just signing another online petition.
Yeah.
And so,
which feels
COVID
kind of
really
disempowering in a
that.
lot of ways, I think.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, and I think we did see a big acceleration over COVID of people wanting to get out in the garden and having time to do that. And so that was quite interesting for us as a business launching in that time to experience that.
Yeah. And you spoke before about, like, right up front, we were talking about the context here, and you sort of said food waste. And I think that's kind of there's a very linear connection between Subpod and food waste, obviously, because there's waste and we'll put it here and we'll turn it into food. But these other kind of adjacencies are really interesting as well. I think the idea that someone would become more interested in the food supply chain, like it just sounded hilarious when you said it right up front, because I'm like, how many people wake up and go, food supply chain? I'm massively curious about this. But when you start to see food leave your plate and go into a bin, but instead of going into a bin, go into the ground and then produce more food, is the thinking here that, or your observation even, that people start to actually think more broadly about where their food's coming from, what food they're consuming, and the quality of the food, and I guess the way in which that food was created. Is that kind of is it a kind of a gateway to a much broader and deeper thought process for an individual, or is it coming the other way?
Yeah, look, we definitely see it as a gateway, and that's borne out in a lot of the feedback that we get from people who start to become more conscious. I mean, one of the joys of using our systems is that once you have a few things going in your garden, they're just going to keep coming up, and people might be picking a tomato and tasting it and realizing there's another experience to be had with tomatoes that might be different from the one they have when they go and get the cheapest ones they can. So definitely people are starting to think a bit more about where their food is coming from. And also we get feedback quite a lot which is a funny one to me, but a number of people have mentioned that they start thinking about the food they're eating because they want to make sure that their worms in their Subpod kind of become like pets, and they're like, oh, well, maybe the worms wouldn't like that. So
I was trying to work out where you were going to go with that. That's amazing. By the way, just so there's a visual here for other people who are listening, you have a shirt that says plant seeds and sing songs, and it's just framing our conversation perfectly for me at the moment. So just want to make sure everyone else has got that visual. Okay, so you've got people who really start to think about the connection to the to the food supply. It sounds like an odd segue, but I kind of want to understand. It's kind of two related. It's a part A and a part B. I'm curious as to why someone buys a Subpod, and do they think, I want to do my part here and here's a way to do it? Or is there some kind of romantic notion which is kind of what sparks the idea, and then they attach or rationalize it or post-rationalize it in some kind of economic thing of, hey, if I do this thing, like I might make some food that I wouldn't otherwise have to buy and it would be fresher anyway. Like what's the process someone's going through, do you think, when Subpod becomes the solution to this thing that they are encountering?
Look, I think there's a few different, I guess, if you want to get into marketing talk, customer avatars out there. So we've got the people who are really there because they're motivated by wanting to do something positive. They really want to have a practice in their life that makes them feel like they're doing something that is good for the planet, and by diverting their food waste, that's one piece of the puzzle for them. And often they might not be able to afford Tesla Powerwall and an electric car and those types of things, but methane is a huge driver of global warming. In the short term, it's going to drive a lot more than CO2 just because it's heating effect, and methane is the major gas that's emitted from food waste breaking down in landfill, and there are quite a lot of people who are conscious of that. Then we do have a lot of people who are there because they're gardeners and they just want the best out of their garden and the best productivity, and they're really looking after their soil. And then also there's kind of we call them the urban foodies, people who may be really into cooking with amazing fresh produce from the farmer's market, and they want to be more engaged with that type of soil to plate experience, and have learnt, I mean, if you go on Netflix these days, you'll see documentaries like Fantastic Fungi that talk about the soil, like the mycelium networks and soil food web, or some of the other documentaries around soil regeneration. And so people are experiencing these things in the popular culture and want to be involved. And I think that there's that hunger there that, how do I get involved in this? So it's quite a broad range of motivation.
Yeah. I mean, it's I'm curious as well, just in terms of, it doesn't sound like any of this is narrow to a particular age range either. There's all range of age of people, or people who are multi-generational, where it's like, I'm going to get one of these because I want my children to know about this stuff and be more aware of this kind of stuff. I'm guessing you see that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over 50% of people who start composting with Subpod, it's their first time trying composting. And we get people from their early to mid-20s all the way through the 50s plus who are using the systems.
Everything in between. And so I grew up in a house where we had compost, and emptying the compost was one of the worst things that you had to do as a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, because you'd take this thing that was already partially decomposed and you'd go down to this part of the garden that was full of spiders, and then you'd lift this metal lid off, and then when you lifted it off, there was all this other stuff growing up inside of it, and then that smell was horrendous. Like, it was just not ideal as a 7 or 8-year-old. And then that was the end of the journey. I don't ever know what happened after there was no plants growing out of it. It was basically like a big metal half of a water tank that had been kind of cut in half. I guess the thing that I'm asking here is that did you observe a product where the product execution itself actually wasn't that great? Forgetting community and the zeitgeist and all this other stuff, but the actual delivery of the product was suboptimal, and it was potentially stopping a whole bunch of people who would probably be more than happy to or even enjoy composting as part of a larger connection with nature from actually doing it?
Yeah, that's right. So I had almost an identical experience to you as a child.
Up in the Northern Rivers.
This, big, heavy, soupy bucket that might get emptied once a fortnight and, pretty terrible experience. But we had so many chickens and things that would get in there, and that's just not the way most people are living. And so I was looking for something that I could get involved with that would give me entry into working with soil and talking about soil health and the circular economy when I met Andrew, who originally designed the prototypes, and saw what he was doing from the kind of the user experience and design thinking context. So I thought, wow, this is actually really powerful. It's simple to use. People get it immediately, and it takes away so many of those problems that people just don't want to deal with and causes them to have these terrible experiences that make them give up. So that was really the motivation for thinking, hang on, this is maybe the product that with some commercial design skill and marketing, we could actually create something of impact here. And I'd just previously helped set up another business called Flow Hive, which was around beekeeping and honey. And yeah,
right.
So I done all the marketing, e-commerce, and set up their communities and things as well. And was looking for somewhere I could take that learning and work with soil, because it was, one of my big passions and something I'd been interested in for a long time.
Hence the T-shirt.
Hence the T-shirt.
Plants the heat sing songs for those who weren't playing along earlier. It kind of comes back
It's one of our T-shirts, actually.
Okay, I'll have to get one. It comes back to something that I thought may have been part of this as well. And you mentioned before the amount of cost that it still was, $250,000 to go out and get a mold built to be able to make some of these to solve the problem, barring the initial prototypes. But we do live in a world now where, things can be 3D printed, things can be shipped, DTC, like direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands are 100 times easier to set up now than they were even 10 years ago. Maybe not 100 times simpler to make successful, but the tools to bring things like this to market have certainly become a lot more accessible. Forgetting the market conditions for a minute, but would executing this a decade ago have been viable or possible, do you think? Or are we part of now in a market where there's a much lower barrier to get into market if you do have a good idea and a good path to market with it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the tools make it possible for sitting regional area in Australia with customers in 26 countries, and that just wasn't possible, probably 10 years ago. I was working back then doing a bit of web development work, but e-commerce was a very different industry 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
And the systems were much harder to use, higher barrier to entries, and it's made it easier to launch something like this. I don't think things have changed in terms of the playbook for actually building a viable long-term brand, but in terms of actually launching and giving something a go, it is easier these days, for sure.
And good segue as well, because is that your background, being brand building and understanding how to build like commercial or customer propositions? Is that?
Look, it's part of my background. I have an interesting background.
Please,
so I don't have a traditional education in it. As I said, I grew up in that kind of alternative community. So I guess a lot of the playbook that I've adopted has come from the activism movement. My family and the community that I grew up in were part of forest activism, social activism around social justice issues in Australia and things. And one of the things I found interesting as I've over the years got into sales and marketing because I wasn't qualified for anything and taught myself along the way. But I'm always curious and reading histories, and I found that a lot of the original internet marketers back in the 80s in Silicon Valley actually came out of the activism movement and took those principles into what became direct response online marketing. So it was quite interesting for me to kind of find those parts meetings. Yeah.
It's probably not going to do it justice to try and unpack it in a couple of minutes, but you talked about these principles of activism. Can you give me a little more color on that?
Yeah. So I guess the school of thought that I grew up around a lot was, funnily enough, a lot around systems theory and systems thinking, and how do we kind of create movements that can make positive change in the world. So how do you present a problem in a way that's going to get some attention and create some kind of action? And maybe some examples of that from the past might be the forest action movement up in northern New South Wales that my family were a part of in the early days. I was a very small baby at the time, but
didn't chain you to a tree, just themselves, presumably.
My father was arrested with me on a baby pouch on his back at the Protesters Falls, which is the first successful forest action in Australia that really saved a large piece of old growth rainforest. Early 80s, and then more recently in our Northern Rivers area, the coal seam gas issue at Bentley, where the huge part of the community came together to create action that stopped coal seam gas fields coming up in our area. And so there's a lot of principles you learn about how to bring a community together around a purpose when you're growing up on the edges of those movements, and just seeing groups of people trying to figure out how to live a way that maybe has less impact on the planet, is more fair. That was just kind of the conditions I was raised in. That's what the whole alternative movement was about and still is about. And some of it can be naive and misguided at times, but there's also a lot of gold there.
Yeah. It's funny as well because I think, and I kind of made the remark about chaining yourself to a tree. I think I'm using it to put us in the context, but I think there's a misconception that someone who's prepared to take that type of action is completely anti-capitalist, anti the idea of creating a product and selling a product and making a profit. And I think this idea of these things, these worlds of Venn diagrams that should never intersect, is actually not what modern activism looks like, in my opinion. And I think it's now clear that there's a way to be true to the values and the purpose that you espouse and want to be part of, but then also combine that with something that actually brings a product into the world that people pay for and makes a profit that allows a reinvestment into more of the action that is aligned to those values. Is that kind of a leap that, do you agree? I'm happy for you to disagree, but also, is that kind of a leap that you had to make, or did you was it a natural evolution of kind of how you grew up and where you went from there? How did that kind of play out for you?
Yeah, look, it's definitely a misconception, I think, and that a lot of people hold, that everyone who maybe wants to see less impact on the planet and a more fair society doesn't want to be involved in the messy business of business. Right. And that's certainly a lot of people out there. For me, the way that I think about it and the way I was brought up is to think long term. A lot of people when they talk about the narrative maybe of the climate crisis, it's about we've got to save the planet. And my context is, well, the planet's going to be fine. If you think in billions of years, we're just a little blip.
And the surface nuisance, I think George Carlin's direct quote was.
And so really it's about, do we want to extend the conditions that make our life and civilizations here and quality of life, everything that is important to us, do we want that to be possible for a period of time that we might have now? And so that's how I think about it. And that also, where that has taken me over the years is thinking, well, there's really not a lot of value in the long term if I'm sitting in a little corner of the country in a valley doing the things that I want to do that maybe are living a bit lightly on the planet, but I'm just ignoring what's happening out in the rest of the world because that's where the real game is afoot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about this as cultural change. So we've got to go out and participate in culture and be part of the cultural conversation and make things like environmental and social good be attractive as something for mainstream people. And that is a big change that's happened over the years. And I think we hopefully are at a tipping point. The caveat for that might be, the early 90s, we had that as well. Not many people remember I was part of a teenage environmental activism group then. And we had Severn Suzuki get up at the Rio de Janeiro UN summit and give her amazing keynote address. She was the Greta Thunberg of my generation.
Yeah. And then what happened?
Then we kind of went on the biggest growth binge in human history after that. So yes, we're in another moment in time where it's possible to shift things and make a change. Just because we're focused on it right now as a society doesn't necessarily mean that we're done and dusted, but it's a time now where we can hopefully with understanding and compassion for other people's points of view, talk about it in a way that feels accessible and bring more people along. Because really, as I said, it's not about are we saving the planet? It's about are we saving ourselves and everything we hold dear.
Yeah. I guess the life that individually and collectively we've become accustomed to.
That's right.
Or even a better version of that, hopefully. Just coming back as well to Subpod specifically, as at the time of recording this, just finished a pretty reasonable crowdfunding thing, I would say. I don't know what the right words are, but have executed that well. I'm trying to understand what the road ahead looks like for you. You've got customers in 26 countries. From memory, you've sold about 16,000 of these things. Is that right? Subpods?
About 64,000
64,000
to date.
Sorry.
Yeah.
4 times the number I just said, which is amazing. And you talked about it's not enough to be sitting in the northern rivers, living lightly on the land. Like, what's the next big hill? What's the next big thing in front of you that you're trying to tackle? And like, what's the battle here? And like, how are you thinking about that? And like, what are the big enablers for you in terms of executing that, do you think?
Sure. So really, we're focusing at the moment on making our systems more accessible for people in dense urban areas. That's a big focus because as cities and urbanisation is a huge global trend, and it's where we have the most waste, by volume. If we're looking at cities as a whole, they're actually often more efficient just because of the density of living. But these types of practices where you're actually engaging with nature and growing a bit of food and things can be fairly rare in a city. So we're trying to build systems that fit into everyday life for people in urban areas. So we've recently released a balcony version of our garden system. So it's a raised bed on wheels with a Subpod in it, so you can grow food around the outside and compost your food waste, on a balcony or in a courtyard, and also building accessories around that fit with the urban lifestyle. So the next version of our community will have IoT connectivity, so you're able to monitor what's happening in your garden and composting system and get your reminders, because people are busy and we do need those behavioural cues. So that's really an important part of the puzzle for us. And with our largest systems as well, we're getting more and more pilots in places like residential developments where they might have up to 50 subpods that are being managed by a community and groundskeepers. So being able to allow people to do it collectively and have started talking to agri-hood managers in America, that agri-hoods are a huge and growing part of the real estate sector, especially places like California.
Is it like an agricultural neighbourhood? Is that what that is?
That's right. So people who want to live close to nature and have those ideals, but they don't want to have a farm, so they move into a community that will have agricultural activities on the fringe and sustainably built homes and apartments for the residential piece.
Does this exist in Australia as well, or this is just a phenomenon that's emerging out of the US, or where's that come? I have not heard the term before.
There are some in Australia and growing, but America is really the place where they're happening on a larger scale. I mean, if you look to Europe, it's a model that's been used over there for a really long time, where often there'll be communities with shared gardens and all kinds of things. But this is, in America, it's a fairly new phenomenon that you might have, like some of the larger ones will have up to 30,000 residents when they're fully complete. So
fascinating idea.
It's a growing trend.
Yeah, I'd love to find someone who's developing those, because I imagine there'd be a lot of competing interests, but also complementary aspects to how you build one of those. Total different rabbit hole to go down. I do have a couple of follow-on questions just on the balconies and on the commercial side, because we didn't touch on it too much. And I'm kind of reminded of a conversation that we had with Julia and Geordie Kay over at Great Wrap, where they released a compostable Glad Wrap or Saran Wrap for US people, Cling Wrap for the UK people, I think. But anyway, but ultimately they saw that the massive lever here was to change the wrap that was being used in these commercial context rather than necessarily at home, where there actually isn't. There was only about 10-15% of the usage from memory. Oh. Do you have a similar situation here where there's a lot of food waste happening in households, and we start there because we start with community, but a lot of the big levers are companies, or actually there's huge amounts of food waste on both sides of the ledger, and really you've got to be tackling all this to really hit the dial? How does that breakdown actually look?
Oh, look, there is huge amounts on both sides of the ledger. We're far, far from solving the on-site, at-home food waste issue. That's been our focus, partly just because of our background as a company. Having that ability to scale as a consumer brand quickly has been really important for us. We've not had the luxury of having a huge amount of funding to be able to run at these big losses that some startups do.
Yep.
And so the consumer side, we were able to have a large cultural impact there, and we're able to have a large impact on people's food waste there. But we're very interested in the commercial side, and that's why we continue to develop that side of the business and have R&D partnerships with a number of companies and organisations that are using our systems in that way, as well as schools, which are another. Schools are power users of our product too. So I think the largest school system uses 50 subpods and offsets the entire food waste.
Is that a school in Australia, by the way? Or
yeah, it's a school in Australia up in Tweed Heads is doing that.
That's amazing. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
If you've got a link for that, I'd love to they'd have a write-up of it somewhere. I'd love to have a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's Lindisfarne College up in Tweed Heads. I'll send you a link to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And is it, like, when you just talked before about a cultural movement, is the aspiration here for kind of a subpod in every home? Is that kind of how you think, whether it's your subpod or someone else's subpod, is there kind of, until there's one in every home, you'd think, why wouldn't there be? Is that kind of your mental model?
Yeah, I mean, that's the mental model, is everyone should be doing their part, composting as much as they can at home. And it's a model that has kind of regulatory validation as well. We have councils providing rebates for composting systems in Australia. If you look at the US, increasingly there's strong regulation there too. So California's recently introduced composting laws where you have to separate food waste and ideally compost at home. There'll be fines coming in as part of that from 2024, and there's just not enough infrastructure there to do everything as off-site composting anyway. China's another example. They have to, in many provinces, they now separate their home waste into 8 different waste streams for processing.
Wow.
Everywhere you look in the world, waste is a huge problem, and we're starting to regulate for it because it's something that we don't think about, but is one of the biggest problems we have in the world.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's direct correlation to the things we consume and the size of the number of people consuming. So both of those things haven't gone down, to your point, since the early 90s. So that's kind of where we are. And I think we're at time today, which was, I feel like there's a lot more rabbit holes that we can go down today. But I guess I just have one last question. Like, in terms of is there a specific thing that is, would be an ask of you? You're massively community minded. I'm guessing you give back a lot and to the community that you serve. But in terms of the people who might be listening today, in terms of the things that you're focused on, anything that is front of mind that you'd be like, would love to hear from people who know this or consider why or might be able to help us with X?
Yeah, look, we're always happy to hear from people who are thinking differently and thinking on a systems level about things like soil health, urban biodiversity, food waste, and as well as we are a young startup, so people who might have bright ideas and are a bit commercially minded who might want to get in touch with opportunities to work and collaborate with us. So always happy to hear from the community. Absolutely.
Love it. Well, thank you, Saadi, for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to you. And now that I know I can use one indoors with my cold environment, I'm going to sort that out in the meantime. And next time we chat, I'm going to have a Plant Seed Sing Songs t-shirt on for myself.
Great. Thank you so much, Vincent. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.